Hey guys, it's Chris Lake with Community for a Cause here, featuring Jimmy Marr, Policy Director of Safe Horizon, to join us during our Sexual Assault Awareness Month series of interviews. Thank you very much, Jimmy, for joining us. Please take a little time to introduce yourself and explain what Safe Horizon is, how long they've been doing what they're doing, and what exactly it is they do.
So thank you so much, Chris, for having me. So my name is Jimmy Marr. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm Policy Director for Safe Horizon, like you mentioned. Safe Horizon is the nation's largest nonprofit victim services organization. We're based entirely in the 5 boroughs of New York City. Each year, we help 250,000 New Yorkers who've experienced violence and abuse across many, many different programs across the city. And I could talk about that in a little bit. And I think what sets us apart is we work with victims and survivors of all forms of violence, which includes intimate and domestic violence, sexual violence, which includes rape and sexual assault, stalking, community violence, gun violence. We work with survivors of homicide, so like family members who have lost a loved one by homicide, and other forms of violence and abuse. Oh, and child abuse too. We operate the 5 child advocacy centers across New York City. So helping, working with kids who have, where there are allegations of sexual abuse or severe physical abuse.
Truly admirable work. I thank you for your service. I thank you and all your team for what they're doing. You said 250,000 New Yorkers a year, just in the 5 boroughs.
Just in the 5 boroughs, yes.
Man, that is some heavy statistics right there, folks. This isn't a light issue, and this is why we're talking about it, because so many people are affected, and even those who might not realize they're affected by it indirectly have reason to be concerned. So we're going to focus today on domestic violence, and we're also going to talk a little bit more about stalking, as you brought up, and some legislation and advocacy that you guys do. But on the topic of domestic violence, when someone is in a partnership and they just started a partnership, are there some red flags and patterns that you can come across consistently that people can be better aware of to understand that it's time to get out, or it's time to start talking to someone about their concerns?
Sure. And we field questions from family, friends of their loved ones who may be going through, be experiencing domestic violence, intimate partner violence. Just a bit about language. Sometimes I use intimate partner violence, sometimes domestic violence, sometimes family violence. All of these terms are kind of intersecting.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the thing that we always want, or what I always want folks to know is, from my years of working with survivors of intimate partner violence, a lot of times the survivors would say, like, I experienced terrible physical violence, may have experienced sexual violence, may have experienced like the most heinous of violence that you can imagine. But sometimes what they're holding on to the most is feeling alienated from their loved ones. So maybe saying, like, when they've told maybe their sister, their mother, their father, a neighbor, like, oh, this is what I'm going through, to like for their loved one to say, like, well, you should have known better, or like, this is what you need to do, this is what you should do. And domestic violence is all about power and control. So the person, our colleagues at the Anti-Violence Project, I learned from them, it's like when you're thinking about like one person's world is getting smaller while the other person's world might be getting bigger. So a survivor, somebody who is experiencing, and I also use victim and survivor interchangeably as well.
Right.
But survivors who have experienced domestic violence, like, they might feel isolated, that their world is shrinking. So then for their loved ones to then maybe add on unintentionally, like, of course, it's coming from a good place and really wanting to support their loved one.
Right.
But sometimes they would say, like, I didn't raise you to experience violence, like, or to let other people push you around like this.
Right.
So what I tell people who call us looking for support is show support and like partner with people. There's a difference between saying, this is what, like, I know best for you.
Right.
Survivors are the experts in their own safety. They're the experts in their own healing journey. And they may be disclosing to you what they're going through. Don't pile on. Partner, learn more about what resources are out there, and offer, like, hey, do you want to, like, these are the resources. Do you want to call like the 24-hour domestic violence hotline? If you do, like, why don't I could sit here with you? Like, we can make that phone call together.
I like that.
And every survivor's situation is unique. Like, some survivors, it might not be safe to leave right now. Maybe that's something that they're planning, like, down the road, or maybe never. But like we really want to individualize like safety planning, and loved ones can do that too. Safety planning is really just starting what's been working and building on top of that.
I like that. And I just want to reiterate a very important point that I've heard you say, and across the interviews I've had this week, this consistent pattern I keep coming across is isolation. And I think if anyone's watching this and listening and you're in a relationship and you feel like your intimate partner is isolating you socially, isolating you financially, isolating you from your family, pay attention. That's not healthy. That's not what a healthy relationship is supposed to do. Pay attention, trust your intuition, trust your gut if you feel something's off and you feel like you are getting isolated and your world, as Jimmy said, is getting smaller. That's such an important point, excuse me. Thank you, Jimmy. Thank you. I suppose I want to ask, you said sometimes it's not safe, and that's also something to consider. The one who is causing harm might not be stable. They might have a criminal history. They might be prone to physical, sexual violence. So if someone is in a situation where they've been in a relationship for a long time and they're ready to get out, what steps can they take? What success stories have you heard where someone was ready to get out and they got out of a situation that was not safe?
Yeah, so with safety planning, like, so anybody who is like thinking about leaving or wants to talk through resources or talk through options, you can always call, like Safe Horizon, we operate the domestic violence hotline for New York City. That's 1-800-621-HOPE or 1-800-621-4673. And we can link you to our continuum of care. Like I mentioned at the beginning, we have many different programs across New York City, community programs, family court programs, criminal court programs, so many different programs and resources there that are there for survivors. We'll provide resources, we'll provide information and options. We're always going to target, like we're always going to safety plan in an individual way. So Safe Horizon, our approach is trauma-informed and client-centered. And by client-centered, it's starting with the client, mirroring their language. So that's why I said like sometimes victim, sometimes survivor, sometimes abuser, sometimes person causing harm, sometimes like just your boyfriend, your ex-boyfriend, your partner. We're using whatever language the victim, the survivor, the client sitting in front of us is using, because we don't want, like, we want to build rapport with this person. We want to partner with them. And the quickest way to just to lose rapport is to talk over somebody and use wrong language, like use language that doesn't feel right for them. Right. So with safety planning, it's really just individualized. Like I said, one thing that one option that might work for one survivor is like the exact opposite of what's going to work for another survivor. Like domestic violence shelter, for example, might be the best thing that ever happened to one of our clients, and it might be the worst thing that ever happened to another client. Because just thinking about domestic DV shelters, they're confidential. They're away from where the abuse happened. And we mentioned isolation and alienation. The idea of picking up and going somewhere else, like that might be strange and foreign for this person and for this client and for maybe their kids, where maybe now they've lost connection with their church or their religious community, the schools, maybe like their job. So that's why we really want to walk clients through like all of those options and help them think through like what is the best thing that works for you. And we are never going to tell them what's going to work for them, what should work for them. We don't provide, at least like social workers, we don't provide advice. We're not attorneys. So we don't provide advice. We really just walk through like these are the options, these are the systems. Like we're experts in like how systems work. Like, oh, you want a family court order of protection? This is what that looks like. Right. And these might be like the potential safety risks about going to family court. Okay. So, I mean, those are the conversations that we're having with each client that's calling our hotline, reaching out to our Safe Chat, which is like a chat feature on our website, safehorizon.org, and across all of our programs.
Love it. I love it. I want to tap into this domestic violence shelter system that you said. Now, one thing that is very interesting is, as you said, for some people, this might be the perfect option. For others, it's just creating further isolation. And if they only had a few advocates in their corner, now they're further removed. But if someone feels this is an option for them, please explain how it works, what steps they take, um, and what's available in the 5 boroughs.
And I apologize, a radio is going by outside.
No worries.
Um, so so Safe Horizon, we operate like I said, the 24-hour domestic violence hotline. That is like the first, like if you are a victim, a survivor of domestic violence, of intimate partner violence, and you're seeking shelter, you would want to call that hotline first. The hotline is going to provide like an intake. We have access to the system where we're able to see what's available, like in which boroughs. The domestic violence shelter system in New York City, across the state, but specifically in New York City, is really set up for individual adults with children. So there's always a struggle finding availability for single adults trying to get into domestic violence shelter. That doesn't mean it's not possible.
Right.
But that's one of those things that we're letting clients know right away, that we can call the hotline to see if there's availability. If not, that doesn't mean that there aren't other options, but to get into DV shelter, it's calling the hotline, doing the intake, and then they're going to connect you to, if there is availability, connecting you to that shelter operator. There are many different nonprofit organizations that operate domestic violence shelters across New York City. Safe Horizon, we operate, I believe it's 8 of them, 6 crisis domestic violence shelters, and then 2 what's called tier 2 shelters, which is like the next step in the DV shelter world. And then it really is like, okay, if there's availability and like they've accepted you, like everything works out, it is like pick up and go. Like you want to like there's like a specific time frame that you have to really relocate into the DV shelter. When you're in the shelter, that's where they're going to connect you. That shelter operator is going to connect you to services inside the shelter. So residential specialists and counselors who are then walking you through like, what are we doing after the time runs out for you to be in DV shelter. So not to get into the weeds, but like, so there are different shelter systems. There's the the domestic violence shelter system, and then there's like homeless shelter systems. And domestic violence is one of the primary drivers of homelessness in New York City.
Right.
Like it drives me bonkers when people don't just like recognize that. Like domestic violence survivors are in all of the different shelter systems. Including the runaway and homeless youth shelter system. Each shelter system really has like their own then housing options that they can link the residents to. But like our residential specialists, our counselors, like our case managers are really walking, again, each survivor through what is available to them based on their situation and really working to help connect them to those more long-term affordable housing solutions.
Wow, incredible work. I'm glad to hear that there's a tier system, there's different availabilities, and the idea that you can pick up and go. Like if it's that night that you need to get out, that option is available. If you make the proper arrangements, so to speak. So people who are listening, have some hope. If you need to make the call, make the call. If you need someone to be there to make the call with you, make the call. But take care of yourself. Recognize the signs around you.
Yeah, and some survivors may decide like, you know what, actually, I don't want to go into the shelter system because I mean, the shelter system also, there are rules. And again, we started by talking about like that domestic violence is about power and control. The idea of going into like a system where there are like rules and regulations and you need to like curfews, like for some survivors, it's like, that's just not going to work for me.
Right.
And like, especially because it could be triggering. It could be re-traumatizing sometimes. It's
another
like
system of control and rules that they're like, nope, no.
Exactly.
Right.
So for some survivors, it's like, you know what? I have a friend, like maybe outside of New York City or inside New York City. And like, maybe what I'll do is I'll go stay with them while I'm working things out. So again, we're always creating that individual safety plan, working with survivors, partnering with them to help them figure out what is their best next steps.
Beautiful, beautiful. Now you say that domestic violence is all about power and control. I'm curious if, and we talked about this a bit before the interview, if stalking is the lead up version of that. I'm curious about the nature of the person who is committing domestic violence. I'm also curious about the nature of stalking. So I guess let's first talk about stalking and then we could talk a bit about the perpetrator. How does stalking play into DV?
Sure. So stalking so it's a pattern, right? So stalking, like domestic violence, it's like a pattern. It's more of like a movie instead of a snapshot.
Okay.
So with stalking, again, it's like about access, it's about control. We so often as society, when we're thinking about stalking or talking about stalking, the story that we usually tell is like, okay, there's a famous person and they're being stalked by like a fan.
Right.
And that happens. Like we know that exists. But stalking, I think, is much more pervasive than just that scenario.
Okay.
Stalking is very much connected to, like, it's interconnected with domestic violence, with intimate partner violence.
Right.
Within an abusive relationship, there could be stalking, even with somebody that you've known for a very long time. If it's about access and just like I don't have the definition of stalking in front of me right now.
That's okay.
It's like a pattern of like coercive behaviors that is really, I think, would cause like I forget what the term is, but kind of like an ordinary person to fear for their safety.
Okay.
And if it's about access, I mean, it could be like, it could start with like phone calls and text messages. It could then escalate to going after the person's car or leaving them gifts and packages. So we educate folks that are coming to us, like specifically around stalking, or maybe when they're talking about what they're experiencing, maybe helping connect the dots for them about what stalking is and what it isn't. Again, walking them through like this, like the definitions, and then their options. So especially if they're trying to get like an order of protection. In New York City, that's what we call like a restraining order.
Mm-hmm.
And with stalking, so often it's a relatively new penal law in New York. New York State, it's like been on the books for only a couple of decades, which that's relatively young. Like
compared to all other laws, right?
Exactly. And it's almost about like evidence collection. So like, it's okay, why don't like keeping a journal, but thinking about it, like keeping a journal where it's not going to hurt you if it's ever used as evidence. Like you don't want to put anything in there that's going to make you seem like you've done something wrong.
Okay.
But like, it's really about, I think, trying to capture each individual incident. Like on this day at this time, my general guidance is usually like start with the most recent thing and work your way backwards, just because the most recent things are fresher in your mind.
Right.
The date, the time, what happened, were there witnesses? Do you have evidence? So, I mean, if it's texts and phone calls and voicemails, like, is there a way for you to save those things in case you ever do decide to go to law enforcement? Again, every survivor has their own individual needs and safety needs. That includes on whether they're going to go to law enforcement or not. There's so many reasons why our clients do not choose to call 911 or go to the police or go to the courts. It could be fear of retaliation. Their abuser, the person causing them harm, could be in law enforcement, which complicates things sometimes. Fears around immigration. There are so many, and we also know that a lot of many survivors also sometimes are the person that gets arrested. The situation that is most
wait, say that again.
Sometimes the survivor might be the person that's arrested on the scene, even if they were the one that called 911.
Okay, you have to go into detail on that one.
Okay,
all right.
So there are some organizations that specifically work with criminalized survivors. So that's kind of like the phrase the term that we use, criminalized survivors. So the example that I can give that I think that I saw the most when I used to do direct service, I'm on the policy side of things now, but I used to do direct service, is, so for example, the survivor that we're in, trigger warning, like talking about actual violence here, like the survivor that came in or that calls us, maybe they were being strangled by their partner. And to protect, like out of self-defense, like they scratched the person that's strangling them. But when the police come, who's the injured party?
All they see is a scratch, right?
They just see the one person bleeding, and maybe like with strangulation, especially with folks with darker skin, the bruising may not show up right away. And there is protocol that NYPD and law enforcement are supposed to use, just in terms of like special cameras and evidence collection. But things don't always work the way that they're supposed to. In fact, a lot of times they don't work the way that they're supposed to. So sometimes the survivor is the one that actually gets arrested.
Wow.
And there are high profile cases where some domestic violence survivors, people who have experienced years of abuse, decades of abuse sometimes, maybe murder their abusive partner because out of self-defense.
Right.
There are cases right now where there are petitions like release this person from jail, like drop the charges, because it was just by the circumstances of how things played out that's how it ended.
Right.
And the survivor, the person who's experienced years of trauma and abuse, is now the one that is now being like incarcerated, or where our charges are being filed against them. And that's not just.
No.
So
Not just.
those are kind of like, those are the cases that I remember, like when we're like just thinking about criminalized survivors. And so that's what we know, that's why, especially, I mean, thinking about 2020, and all of the racial justice protests, like there are like all of the messages that we were hearing from staff, from clients, like this is why we don't go to the police. And that's, again, that's not for there are survivors that like they want to be able to call 911 and have a police officer come, and there are other survivors that are looking for other options. So that's why we're always trying to advocate for, let's make our systems better, let's make them more accountable, more transparent, less violent. And what are those other approaches to violence that we could be building outside of the criminal legal system, the criminal justice system, so that survivors are able to choose their options. Safety looks different for every survivor. Justice looks different for every survivor. Healing looks different for every survivor. So we're really just trying to build out options for folks so that they can navigate their path forward in the ways that feel right for them.
Absolutely. Now, speaking of options, I brought up to you in a few emails this app called Victim's Voice. Have you had a chance to look into this?
I did look into it, and I asked one of my colleagues at our domestic violence law project if she had heard of it, and she had not, but she wanted to learn more about it.
Oh, I'm so excited for this. So it just, a friend of mine referred me to the creator a couple months ago when I said, listen, we got to chat sometime. We've been talking. And then during Sexual Assault Awareness Month, I said, I got to interview you about your app. And just to give you the gist of it, it's a web-based portal app. So there's no downloading. So in case someone has a partner who monitors their phone, they won't find an app that is keeping track of what's happening. And it allows someone who is experiencing abuse to upload records, photos, recordings that are all court admissible. And it will be held indefinitely for years, so long as you pay, X amount of dollars for the year that you need it. And I just think it is so neat. Honestly, I think it helps those build a case, anything. And she explains things that you can upload include doctor's notification if you go to the doctor, pictures of the actual abuse, photos of beer bottles all over the apartment, pictures of holes in the wall, pictures of pet abuse, because oftentimes domestic violence goes hand in hand with animal abuse. So there's so many different ways that you can build a case to protect yourself, if not immediately, then down the road. And I want to be sure anyone who's out there who is suffering from domestic violence knows there are ways that you can get out of your situation. This app, Victim's Voice, you can find it at victimsvoice.app. And use it today to help yourself build some court admissible information. And Jimmy, I tell everyone that I've interviewed, I tell everyone that I've come across, like, check this app out, spread the word, because I feel like it's just such a useful tool for those who are in a vulnerable position to protect themselves.
Yeah, it sounds great. And I'm going to be forwarding that information to my colleagues, especially the ones who are in our legal programs. We do have some legal programs. And you mentioned animal abuse. So I really just wanted to emphasize that all of these different forms of violence are interconnected. Like, you can't talk about domestic violence, intimate partner violence, family violence without talking about gun violence and stalking and animal abuse and elder abuse and child abuse and community violence. All of these forms of violence are definitely interconnected. And we work with survivors who have experienced many different forms of violence. And that is just one thing I want to emphasize. And I believe that all of these forms of violence are also just interconnected with systems of repression, which sexism, misogyny, racism, homophobia, transphobia, all of those larger systems of oppression are definitely connected, linked with all of these forms of violence that people experience on an individual basis, but also on a systemic, more societal-wide basis.
Right. You have your work cut out for you, right? I do admire it. Now, we were talking about.
I believe that we can end violence. You can call, I believe it. I believe that we can end violence.
Me too. That's why we're talking.
Exactly. We can end poverty. We can end homelessness. We can end violence.
It's possible as long as enough people allow themselves to first imagine. I tell people, and they look at me like I'm crazy. I see world peace in 10 years. And they say, Chris, I'm like, yeah, I see it in 10 years because we've never done it. So we don't know how long it'll take. B, you have to picture it before it's real. Before the Wright brothers made an airplane, they were bicycle engineers. And they said, you know what, let's try and do what these guys 400 years ago drew sketches about and play. And they made it work. And then within the same century, we got to the moon. Like, you have to vision certain things, and miracles are only things that people previously thought was impossible. Once you cross that threshold, it's like, okay, I guess we can do it now. Before I go off on a tangent, I do want to bring back the work that you guys do, and you guys do a lot of advocacy and legislative work. In particular, you guys are working on the Adult Survivors Act, and I want you to explain to people how important this is, talk about what work you've done to help get the gears going in the legislative chambers.
Yes, so we are working really, really hard to get the Adult Survivors Act passed in Albany this legislative session. And this legislative session ends at the beginning of June. And now is better time than ever. Like you said, April is Sexual Violence Awareness Month, Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And we have a lobby day on Tuesday where we're going to be going up to Albany to meet with legislators. So the Adult Survivors Act is really the next step after another law that we passed several years ago called the Child Victims Act, or the CVA. And we fought for over a decade to get the Child Victims Act passed. The Child Victims Act, what it did is that it changed the statute of limitations on child sexual abuse prospectively, so moving forward. And it opened up a 1-year window, like a retroactive window, where no matter how long ago the abuse happened or how old you are now, you would be able to file a civil lawsuit against the abuser or the negligent institution. And we were able to pass, it was one of the first things that passed in January 2019 and was signed into law in February of 2019. And then that 1-year window was actually extended for about another year because of COVID. The courts were closed. So it's like, we can't allow this 1-year window to exist, to be open without people being able to actually file lawsuits.
Right. So
the previous governor did work with the legislature to extend that civil legal window open. Around the same time, the legislature also changed the statute of limitations on adult sexual abuse, so abuse that have happened to somebody who was 18 or older prospectively. So again, moving forward, so the abuse afterwards. The group of survivors that have been left out of those solutions are people who were assaulted when they were 18 or older, and the statute of limitations have expired. So it's what the Adult Survivors Act would do. It would open up a 1-year window for those survivors to be able to file a civil lawsuit against their abuser, or again, a negligent institution. The Child Victims Act, like it's still in the news all the time. The window is closed now, but those lawsuits are playing out, and the high profile ones are against the Catholic Church, Boy Scouts, like different institutions. And part of why we're,
so big.
Yes, and institutions fought against the Child Victims Act. And we were finally able to get it over the finish line when it was one of the first things that happened when Democrats took the state Senate in New York. That is the reality that we were dealing with at the beginning of 2019. So one of the reasons that we push so hard is that like this is the way to like air out what is being hidden by especially larger institutions, holding institutions to account, but then also incentivizing institutions like you need to make changes now. Like you just need to, like, even though things have happened in the past and you need to be held to account, it's also like you need to change. And that's also why we're fighting for the Adult Survivors Act. Many of our, so we have survivors that are part of our coalition who have been assaulted by high profile, like serial abusers, and where those abusers were protected by institutions. So survivors of that are part of our coalition include survivors of Dr. Haddon, who's this OBGYN who assaulted over like 100 patients, survivors of Harvey Weinstein, of Jeffrey Epstein. One of our key partners is the Model Alliance, that is really providing support to models and people in the fashion industry that are so often victimized by people that are in positions of power within those institutions. So we are fighting so hard to get the Adult Survivors Act passed. Last year, it passed unanimously in the state Senate. It was never brought up for a vote in the Assembly. We are feeling very optimistic that it will pass in the state Senate again soon. Our focus is really on the Assembly, and we're building support outside the legislature, but we're also building support inside the legislature. We are adding co-sponsors like every week, every month, and we are hopeful that it will pass in both houses of the legislature soon, and that Governor Hochul will sign it into law.
I'm here with you. I remember meeting Michael Pollenberg in Albany last May and talking about the Adult Survivors Act. And I thought to myself, this is wild that you have to fight so hard for something that seems so common sense. You said it took 10 years for the Child Victims Act, 10 years for that to pass. I'd like to hear a little bit about what was in the way. Because obviously when you're pushing for legislation, for those who don't know, when you're pushing for legislation, no matter what legislation you're pushing for, there is someone who opposes it. And you might not believe that, but it's generally the case. So Jimmy, explain a little bit about what 10 years of opposition looks like when you're asking for those who have been affected by sexual violence as children, seeking justice, could come across.
So, I mean, it was really the larger institutions that were lobbying really, really hard, putting a lot of money behind their lobbying and advocacy efforts to make sure that the Child Victims Act did not come up for a vote. And it would pass in the Assembly each year, but it was always being stymied in the state Senate. Again, that was like one of the first things that the state Senate passed when Democrats took control of the state Senate after the 2018 midterms. So that is why, so it was the larger institutions like the Catholic Church, Boy Scouts of America, other religious institutions and larger institutions, and I believe insurance companies. So, I mean, it was institutions that knew they were going to be sued and that there would be money on the line if they lost those lawsuits. Right. And like I said, those lawsuits are playing out now. And like to show how arbitrary a lot of these things are. So we have survivors that are in our network that are helping with the Adult Survivors Act. 2 different students who were assaulted by the same person at their university. One was they were only months apart in age. One was younger than 18 when the assault happened, and the other one was older than 18 when the assault happened. The student who, and these are adults now, like adult men. So the one who was 17 has been able to sue the institution through the Child Victims Act. But the survivor who was 18 at the time of the assault, he cannot file a lawsuit because the statute of limitations have expired. New York has had, until recently, until a few years ago, just terrible statute of limitations on sex abuse, child sex abuse and adult sex abuse. So like we are fighting for those survivors who, like, because of how arbitrary these lines are, like, what is the difference between somebody who is 17 and a half and somebody who's 18 and a half?
The crime is a crime. And that's what's so frustrating about the way the penal code is written sometimes to me. Because right now I'm fighting for 2 different penal laws, one involving voluntary intoxication and the other for affirmative consent. And I'll talk to different legislators about supporting it. And I get pushback, and I always think to myself, here's the deal, man. This isn't a philosophical debate. There's a violation. Someone's choice was violated and then their body was violated. That's a crime. We can play this philosophical, well, if we think from Blackburn's formula, it's better for 10 guilty men to go free than 1 innocent person be jailed. Or we can think about what's really happening right here is that someone's getting sexually assaulted every 68 seconds. And we should probably have laws that take care of people a little bit better. Frustrating.
Yes. And of course, like what we're talking about right now is violence that has already happened, right? But part of this is also prevention work. Like, again, we want institutions to make changes so that they're not creating toxic environments, right, where this violence can persist. Right. Like what we've seen with like some of these, I mean, we've heard it with about individual priests, individual professors, individual doctors, that they've been able to go from state to state to run away from the harm that they've caused, the violence that they've caused, the trauma that they've caused, because those institutions have not have allowed it to happen.
Right.
This is this is institutions, like all different types of institutions and different professions. But you're right. But I want us to always like focus on like the preventive piece too, that we don't want, of course, we want to build opportunities for healing and for justice and for safety for survivors who have already experienced violence and abuse. But we also want to make sure that this doesn't keep happening. That's why I said, I believe that we can create a future free of violence and abuse. There are so many, like, there's just like so much work that can be done, and everybody, like, there are so many different ways for people to get involved, including doing preventive work and healing work. And I don't know, I feel optimistic when I'm in settings with like advocates and activists and survivors who really want to make a difference, because change is possible.
Right. Be positive, be optimistic. The world needs optimists, because otherwise you're not going to have the creative juices flowing to say, well, how can I change this problem? How can I solve this problem? Jimmy, truly appreciate your time. I want you to take a moment to let people know where they can find you, where they can reach you, and where they can call if they are in need.
Sure. So you can always go to www.safehorizon.org. That's Safe Horizon with no S at the end. There's only one horizon. So safehorizon.org. Our hotline information is on there. Our Safe Chat information is on there. Safe Chat, again, is the platform on our website where you can actually check it, like talk with an advocate through the website. That became especially critical during the pandemic with survivors who were maybe locked in their homes with their abuser or the person causing them harm, so that they could quietly text with an advocate to find out their options, instead of maybe it wasn't safe for them to speak out loud. And there are different hotlines and helpline numbers that are listed on our website. The key one that I would say is 1-800-621-HOPE. That is our domestic violence hotline, and that is a 24/7 hotline here in New York City.
Jimmy Maher, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Chris. Anytime.